Her arrogant smile vanished. Her notoriously gesticulating hands dropped limply. What happened when America's most vocal female politician was brought down live on air with just 4 questions and a calculator? Tiene una estancia de 40 días en la casa de John Kennedy y su hermano AOC. The moderator initiated the segment by establishing a glaringly biased contrast. AOC was introduced with glowing accolades, the youngest woman ever elected to Congress, a transformative icon aggressively reshaping the Democratic Party, complete with her massive 13 million follower count. Kennedy, conversely, was allotted a single, dismissive sentence, the Republican senator hailing from Louisiana. This stark disparity was no accident. Kennedy immediately registered the hostility, mentally filed it away, and held his tongue. AOC aggressively commandeered the conversation before the host could even finish articulating the initial prompt. Her performance was undeniably polished, it always was. She launched into a passionate monologue covering wealth inequality, the impending climate apocalypse, and the tragic reality of working-class families choosing between life-saving insulin and paying their rent. Her hands violently sliced the air with every punctuated syllable, acting as a conductor for an orchestra only she could hear. Then, she abruptly zeroed in on Kennedy. With all due respect, Senator, individuals exactly like yourself have stagnated in Washington for decades, and the solitary thing that has actually changed is the font on the memos, promising we will eventually address it. The moderator offered an approving nod, granting AOC a prolonged, dramatic silence to ensure the insult fully resonated, and purposefully neglected to ask Kennedy for an immediate counterargument. The sheer bias in the studio was palpable. Citizens watching from their living rooms across Ohio, Georgia, and Louisiana clearly noticed the intentional tilt, mentally cataloged it, and patiently waited for the impending reaction. Kennedy softly tapped his knee with 2 fingers, nodded at a glacial pace, and permitted the silence to stretch just past the point of social comfort. "Well," he finally drawled, "that certainly was something." He allowed another calculated beat to pass. "Congresswoman, I am merely an uncomplicated guy from Louisiana, which means you are going to have to assist me in understanding a few items." AOC offered a dismissive half-smile. She was entirely convinced he was just stalling for time. She assumed the broadcast was already her uncontested victory. She had just publicly branded him a relic on national television, and his only defense was a polite smile. If you have ever watched someone arrogantly underestimate the quietest individual in the room, smash that like button immediately, because the trap she proceeds to walk into is legendary. AOC was still surfing the high of her opening assault when she delivered the exact sentence that triggered the avalanche. "My Green New Deal stands as the most ambitious climate legislation in American history, and the people opposing it are actively prioritizing corporate profits over the survival of our planet," she declared. She delivered this statement directly into the broadcasting lens, purposefully ignoring Kennedy's presence. She spoke with her trademark delivery, the absolute, unwavering certainty of a person who had never once been required to mathematically verify her claims. Kennedy simply nodded in agreement. "That is fantastic. I highly value ambition. It reminds me of my young grandson, who once informed me he intended to build a functioning spaceship out of a cardboard refrigerator box. While I deeply admired his visionary spirit, I did possess a handful of questions regarding the actual engineering." A few suppressed laughs echoed from the studio crew. AOC's expression remained deadpan. "Congresswoman, please help me navigate the mathematics here. What is the actual cost?" "The Green New Deal is a fundamental investment in our future, Senator. The true cost lies in our inaction on climate change. I completely understand that concept. But how much does it actually cost to implement the plan bearing your name? The financial penalty of not acting is estimated at Congresswoman. His volume never spiked. It remained terrifyingly level. That was the specific characteristic about Kennedy that the television cameras always failed to capture, and the transcripts could never convey. His voice actually grew softer when he was moving in for the kill, never louder. I am not asking about the price tag of doing nothing. I am asking about the price tag of taking action. Your specific legislative plan. How much is it? She aggressively refused to supply a number. Instead, she fiercely pivoted back to the rhetoric of impending crisis, urgency, and the exact sensationalist language that had forged her fame. Kennedy waited patiently. Then, he proceeded to execute the math himself, moving with the sluggish, deliberate pace of a man counting out loose change at a cash register. Well, the financial estimates I continuously encounter sit somewhere around $93 trillion, and given there are approximately 330 million Americans, if you divide that total up, it equates to roughly $280,000 per individual citizen. Now, Congresswoman, I am unaware of what they teach in the economics department at Boston University, but where I come from, if you hand somebody an invoice for $280,000, they are absolutely going to demand to see exactly what they just ordered. AOC's hands instantly launched into the air. It was the trademark physical choreography that 13 million people had watched 1,000 times before. The hands that aggressively sliced the air, pointed, swept, and conducted her defense mechanisms. This is fundamentally about the survival of our entire planet, Senator. People are actively dying. Communities of color are currently being devastated by environmental injustice, while you comfortably sit here dividing statistics as if this is merely a game. Kennedy sat perfectly still, allowing the sheer volume of her attack to wash over him, identical to a man sitting quietly on a porch letting a thunderstorm pass by. When the studio was quiet once more, he spoke. I hear your passion, Congresswoman. I truly do. However, I asked you for a financial cost, and you responded by telling me that people are dying. Those are two entirely different sentences. The moderator physically leaned in to intervene. Senator, perhaps we should acknowledge that climate policy involves significantly more nuance than just raw numbers. Kennedy, without even shifting his gaze to look at the host, replied, Mom, I completely agree. But the raw numbers represent the part where an actual citizen has to write a check. And the very people responsible for writing that check are watching us right now. AOC was glaring at Kennedy with the fierce intensity of a boxer staring down an opponent who simply refuses to swing back. She was entirely built for confrontation, for deafening volume, and for the specific arena of rhetorical combat where the fastest and loudest voice automatically wins. Kennedy was not fighting, he was calmly counting, and she had absolutely no idea how to land a punch on a man who was holding a calculator instead of a clenched fist. She pivoted aggressively, executing the maneuver she always relied upon when the rhetorical terrain shifted beneath her, a direct, personal attack. Do you want to know what your actual problem is, Senator? You sit comfortably in your chair. You crack jokes. You appear on Fox News. And you have literally never done a single tangible thing for working-class people. I came from absolutely nothing. I was a bartender. I served individuals who worked harder in one single shift than you work in an entire month. I violently fight for working people every single day of my life. And it undeniably landed. Give her credit for that. It landed with immense force, carrying the genuine weight of real anger, the authentic memory of sticky tables she had wiped down, real beverages she had poured, and the meager tips she had meticulously counted at the end of exhausting shifts. The host nodded sympathetically. The studio's gravity tilted heavily back toward AOC, and for a fleeting moment, she embodied the exact thing she was best at, being righteously indignant. Kennedy offered a slow, conceding nod. That is a fair critique. I have not successfully passed many massive bills. That is a true statement. My wife tells me that constantly. She has been telling me that exact thing for 30 years. The room laughed. But Kennedy's facial expression did not shift an inch. But Congresswoman, you just said something highly specific. You stated that you fight for working people. He took a beat. Working people actually pay for their own dresses. AOC's expression violently contorted. Excuse me? The Met Gala? That was a beautiful dress. Tax the rich, written across the back? I liked it. It was very clever. But the entry ticket to that specific party was $35,000. The dress was completely free. The hairstyling was free. The makeup was free. And when the House Ethics Committee pointed out that you failed to pay for portions of it, you immediately claimed your staff handled the logistics incorrectly. Those were merely vendor issues that your team. Congresswoman, I have also tended bar. Did you know that? The room went terrifyingly still. Nobody anticipated that specific revelation. It was a summer job a very long time ago. And I will tell you a secret, when the bar tab didn't add up correctly at the end of the night, the owner didn't look at me, he looked directly at himself, because it was his establishment. He let that reality sit heavy in the air. So when you look at me and say you fight for working people, and then you proceed to attend a party that costs more than most people's vehicles, wearing free designer clothes demanding we tax the rich, and then actively blame your assistants when the invoice arrives. The working people at home, Congresswoman, the exact ones you claim you came here for. They notice that, because they are forced to pay for their own dresses. And they certainly don't receive $35,000 free tickets to anything. AOC's hands shot up again, moving faster and wider than before. This conversation is about deeply rooted systemic inequality. Senator, you are actively trying to reduce an entire global movement down to a single dress. Kennedy simply waited. He waited with the infinite patience of a man fishing in a small pond where the fish have absolutely nowhere to escape. She claimed she fought for the workers. He merely asked who financed the luxury gown. If you have spent your entire life paying your own bills while watching people who do not lecture you about economic fairness, drop the word receipt in the comments and subscribe right now. Because she fires back with her heaviest weapon next. And it nearly works. AOC abruptly ceased her gesturing. Her vocal tone dropped, and her eyes completely changed. This was no longer performative anger. It was something vastly more real and inherently more dangerous. You want to publicly question my integrity? You, Senator? She leaned menacingly forward. You have been entrenched in politics since I was in kindergarten. 30 long years, and Louisiana still boasts one of the highest poverty rates in the entire country. You have literally never authored a single piece of major legislation that successfully became law. Not one. You go on television broadcasts, you make the audience laugh, you secure your viral clips, and then you travel home to a state where children literally go hungry. She was no longer acting, she was actively seeking blood. I arrived in Congress at 29 years old, saddled with student debt, possessing zero money, lacking a political dynasty, and without a corporate law firm backing me. And in my very first term, I aggressively pushed the largest climate legislation in American history, expanded the child tax credit program that lifted millions of children out of destitution and forced this entire country to have the difficult conversations it had been terrified to have for decades. She locked onto him with a steady gaze. You can sit comfortably in that chair and divide massive numbers, Senator, but I have been actively multiplying my impact since the exact day I walked into this city. It landed significantly harder than anything else she had uttered all night. The phrase multiplying impact brilliantly stole Kennedy's own mathematical metaphor and violently turned it back on him like a mirror. The host nodded enthusiastically. The room tilted violently back in her favor. And for a clean, uninterrupted 15 seconds, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was securing a victory in a manner that felt permanently damaging. The host swiveled toward Kennedy. "She does raise a highly valid point regarding your legislative record, Senator. In 30 years, what major legislation have you personally shepherded into law?" The audience at home witnessed it happen yet again. The supposedly neutral host actively helping, sharpening AOC's blade for her, and eagerly handing her an extra round of ammunition. The same citizens who had watched this exact dynamic play out 1,000 times on 1,000 different programs felt their jaws tighten in sheer frustration because it was happening all over again right in front of them, and they found themselves unable to change the channel, simply because the old man from Louisiana was still sitting calmly, still tapping his knee, and still refusing to raise his voice. Kennedy remained completely still. He nodded slowly, and what he articulated next was vastly quieter than anything he had uttered all evening. "You are absolutely right. Louisiana possesses massive problems, big ones, and I certainly haven't fixed all of them. I haven't even fixed the majority of them." He paused. "My wife could have easily told you that. She has been telling me that exact thing for 30 years. The studio laughed softly, the exact way people chuckle when a man invites you to laugh with him instead of laughing at somebody else. But Kennedy's facial expression remained completely unchanged. "But Congresswoman, here is what has been bothering me every single time tonight. I ask you a direct question, and you respond by giving me a speech. And the speech is always beautiful. Truly, you are the most talented speechmaker I have witnessed in 30 years in Washington. I mean that sincerely, but speeches do not pay the rent. And the people sitting at home, the ones sitting at their kitchen tables right now, with a calculator that is older than you are, they can do this exact math. They do it every single month. Rent, groceries, gas, electric bills, medicine. The vital things that absolutely do not care about media headlines. And when the numbers fail to add up, they don't deliver a grand speech about it, Congresswoman. They forcefully cut something. They skip something crucial. They look their child dead in the eye and say, maybe we can do it next month, because that is what actual, real math looks like. And they have been performing it quietly for decades, while the individuals on this side of the television screen boldly tell them the math fundamentally doesn't matter. He locked his eyes onto the camera lens, actively ignoring AOC to speak directly to the people. Those folks are not stupid. They are not ancient dinosaurs. They are not irrelevant relics from some version of America that doesn't exist anymore. They are sitting right there, right now, executing the exact same agonizing task they did last month and the month before that, making the budget work with nobody clapping for them, nobody following them online, and nobody putting them on the cover of a magazine simply for paying their light bill on time. And they are deeply tired. They are genuinely tired of being lectured that their question is the wrong question by elite politicians who have never once had to sit at that kitchen table and actively choose between the gas bill and the grocery bill, and then pretend it didn't hurt. He paused deliberately, and then he delivered a statement that was not meant for the Congresswoman. It was a message directly for the people on the other side of the screen. And when somebody finally dares to ask the question out loud, they won't be surprised by the resulting silence, because they already knew the answer. They have known it for years. They were simply waiting for somebody holding a microphone to finally say it. Every single question yields a speech. Every speech sounds absolutely amazing. But the core question never, ever gets answered. If you have been screaming at your television screen for years asking, what does it cost? Subscribe right now. She is about to make one final desperate claim, and the senator is about to counter with a quiet story. Listen very carefully. AOC, still aggressively pushing and fighting for control, blurted out a statement without thinking. It was delivered the exact way people say the things that ultimately destroy them, casually embedded in the middle of a sentence, treating it like mundane furniture instead of a live landmine. I am 100% people-funded, Senator. Absolutely no corporate PAC money. That is exactly who I am. That is my established brand. And that is significantly more than anyone on your side of the political aisle can honestly say. Kennedy did not flinch. He did not eagerly pounce. He did something that absolutely nobody expected. He simply leaned back into his chair and began telling a story. His voice shifted completely, adopting the slower, warmer rhythm of a man sitting on a porch in the late evening, completely uninterested in winning a debate, and just having a conversation. You know, Congresswoman, I once had a good friend, a highly respectable man who ran a small business down in Madisonville, a plumbing supply outfit, nothing overly fancy. He worked 7 days a week for 20 straight years. He kept immaculately clean books. He paid every single vendor on time. He never owed a dime he couldn't cover. His wife managed the accounting on a computer that is older than your entire political career. He offered a smile, but the warmth did not reach the rest of his face. One day, he hired a fella. A sharp, highly intelligent individual who had big ideas. The specific kind of ideas that make you feel like your tiny plumbing supply store might actually become something massive. And my friend really liked that ambition. Who wouldn't? So he willingly handed the fella the operational keys. Well, this big ideas fella immediately set up a side company. He began moving money rapidly from one account to another, through this LLC and that LLC. He kept the primary ledgers looking incredibly clean on one side, but on the hidden side, $885,000 moved rapidly through shell companies nobody had ever heard of, paying for services nobody could quite explain. It was listed as strategic consulting, which is a corporate term that, in my extensive experience, usually translates to "I'd rather not tell you." When my friend finally found out, he asked the big ideas fella, "Where exactly did the money go?" And the fella simply said, "Strategic consulting." And my friend asked, "What does that actually mean?" And the fellow just left. He simply walked out and didn't even bother to clean out his desk. A long, agonizing beat engulfed the room. Congresswoman, your personal chief of staff, a Mr. Chakrabarty. He set up an entity called Brand New Congress LLC. He then moved $885,000 through it, taking from PACs that you both jointly controlled. The FEC formally investigated the matter. A former chairman of the FEC stated publicly there was more than enough evidence to pursue a criminal case. And immediately following that, Mr. Chakrabarty resigned. Kennedy looked at her with an expression that wasn't accusing, but almost gentle mirroring. The exact way a doctor delivers a grim diagnosis he wishes he didn't have to deliver. Now, I am completely sure there is an explanation. I'm absolutely sure it's a very good one. But your Twitter profile still boldly claims you are 100% people-funded, and the money undeniably still moved to where it moved. And the man who orchestrated moving it mysteriously no longer works for you. I am merely telling a story, Congresswoman. You tell me if any of it sounds familiar. The atmosphere in the room had mutated entirely. The host completely failed to jump in. She did not attempt to redirect the narrative. She offered AOC absolutely zero lifelines. For the very first time all night, the host simply sat perfectly still, stared directly at AOC, and waited exactly the way the millions of people watching at home had been waiting. AOC's hands hesitantly came up, but the movements were significantly slower now, far smaller. Republicans rely on hundreds of millions in untraceable dark money, Senator, the Koch brothers, the Heritage Foundation. Kennedy responded with pinpoint, devastating quietness. I did not ask you about the Koch brothers, Congresswoman. I asked you about your personal chief of staff. And then, before the heavy air in the studio had even settled, AOC made her final, fatal mistake. She reverted to the exact tactic she always used. When the ground shifted beneath her feet, she reached for the absolute biggest weapon in her rhetorical arsenal. The exact phrase that had made her a household name in 2019 and had lived prominently on every progressive highlight reel ever since. She aimed directly for the border. While this presidential administration is actively putting children in cages at the southern border, you have said that before, Kennedy calmly interrupted, acknowledging the truth of the statement. No, I mean you said those exact words during an Instagram broadcast in 2019. You explicitly told the country that the United States was running literal concentration camps on the southern border. You deliberately used the words, never again. And I vividly remember that, Congresswoman, because hearing those words kept me up that night. I know exactly what never again truly means. My father fought in a global war over exactly what it means. It carries immense weight. I agree entirely. It absolutely does. So, when the legislative bill finally came to the House floor, $4.5 billion in humanitarian aid, intended for better conditions, comprehensive medical care, and the exact things you publicly said were missing from those camps you vividly described. Every single thing you claimed was wrong. That specific bill was engineered to fix. He paused dramatically. Why did you vote no? Absolute silence. 7 agonizing seconds. It was the longest silence of the entire broadcast. It was quiet enough to clearly hear the air conditioning hum, long enough to hear a cameraman physically shift his weight. That bill contained provisions that would have actively expanded. Congresswoman. His tone was terrifyingly quiet, level, and as patient as a stone resting at the bottom of a river. You told the entire country it was a concentration camp. You invoked the phrase, never again. The check finally came due, and you voted no. 1 beat, 2 beats. You didn't want to actually fix it, Congresswoman. You merely wanted to say it. Those 8 words hung in the studio air like thick, suffocating smoke. Because everybody present in the room, and everybody watching intently at home, understood exactly what those 8 words truly meant. They meant that the most famous, loudest progressive voice in America had weaponized the Holocaust merely to secure television airtime, and then actively voted against the funding that would have addressed the exact crisis she was tearfully crying about. Not because the legislation was fundamentally flawed, but because voting yes on a solution does not go viral. Only pure outrage goes viral. Only fire goes viral. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had built her entire political empire on fire. AOC opened her mouth and attempted to speak. Children were, but the sentence completely failed to finish. For the absolute first time all night, she forcefully stopped herself, not because she had been rudely interrupted, but because the word simply died somewhere between her throat and the open air. And what replaced that word was absolutely nothing. The host spoke, her voice exceedingly careful now, almost gentle. Congresswoman, would you like to address the senator's question regarding your vote? And every single person watching at home saw the dynamic shatter. The ultimate turn. The host, who had gleefully introduced AOC with 3 glowing paragraphs while restricting Kennedy to 1 sentence. The host, who had nodded along approvingly to every speech, redirected every difficult question, gifted AOC extra beats of silence, and actively interrupted Kennedy twice. That specific host, that very same host, had just physically turned to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and demanded she answer the question. Not a tangent, not a softer, easier question. The exact question Kennedy had been relentlessly pursuing in different formats for 40 consecutive minutes. And the people sitting at home, the ones in Louisiana, Ohio, and the working-class parts of America that this host had likely never visited, they watched it happen, and they felt a profound shift in their chests. Because for the first time in as long as any of them could remember, the television broadcast was actually fighting on their side. Kennedy looked at AOC with an expression that wasn't angry, but rather incredibly sad. "Congresswoman, do you know what I have noticed tonight?" One sentence, and every person watching instantly rewound the last 40 minutes in their minds. "How much does your plan cost?" "People are dying." Her hands had swept dramatically wide. "Who paid for your luxury dress?" "Systemic inequality." Her hands had cut sharper. "Where did the PAC money go?" "Koch brothers." Her hands had gotten noticeably smaller. "Why did you vote no?" "Children were." Her hands had started moving, only to freeze completely. 4 direct questions, 4 massive speeches, 0 answers. And the hands, the world-famous hands, the hands that 13 million followers had watched orchestrate 1,000 political arguments, had gotten progressively quieter each time, as if even her own body knew the truth. "Every time I ask you a question," Kennedy stated, "you give me a beautiful headline. And the headline is always ablaze on fire. But the core question is still sitting there, waiting, exactly like an overdue bill on a kitchen table that nobody wants to open. 4 questions, 4 speeches, 0 answers. And every speech was significantly louder than the last one, except for the final one, which completely failed to finish. If you clearly notice the pattern, share this video right now with one person who desperately needs to see it. Just one. Because there is one final, devastating thing. AOC remained dead quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke again, the polished performance was entirely gone. What emerged was significantly lower, rougher, and brutally honest in a way that compelled the entire room to lean forward. Because it was the authentic sound of a vulnerable human being buried underneath all the flashy headlines. "My father died of cancer when I was just 19. We almost lost our family house. I worked grueling double shifts, bartending and waitressing. I was drowning in student debt I couldn't see the end of. And I ran for Congress specifically because nobody inside that building looked anything like the people I served drinks to." Her voice audibly caught. She permitted it to catch. "I am not perfect, I know that. But I didn't come here to be perfect. I came here to be deafeningly loud, because nobody was listening to us. Nobody was listening to the people in my home district who worked 2 jobs and still couldn't make rent. The parents who intentionally skipped meals just so their kids wouldn't have to go hungry. And if I have to forcefully shout to make this country hear them, then I will gladly shout every single day until they finally hear it." It was raw and real, or it was so incredibly close to real that the distance simply didn't matter. The host stared down at her own hands. Kennedy sat perfectly still. A cameraman in the back lowered his shoulder from the viewfinder just for a brief moment, because whatever was unfolding in the room was deeply human, and the room owed it a moment of respect. She had just laid everything out on the table: the dead father, the brutal double shifts, the desperate fight. It was real. You could literally hear it was real. But the seasoned senator still did not move. He sat there, and he waited. And what he articulated next is the exact reason this specific clip will be actively remembered 10 years from now. Turn on notifications right now so you do not miss a single word." Kennedy allowed the profound silence to hold. He did not rush the moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was fundamentally different from every single voice he had employed that night. It wasn't the folksy Southern drawl, it wasn't the dry comedian, and it wasn't the strict arithmetician. It was something buried underneath all of it, something that sounded exactly like a man who had once sat at a kitchen table himself and stared blankly at a bill he had absolutely no idea how to pay. Something that sounded, for the very first time all evening, like it actively cost him something emotional to say, "Congresswoman, I completely believe you. I believe your father passed away. I believe you worked those grueling doubles. A kid grinding through 2 jobs, paying off massive loans, and walking into the halls of Congress at 29 years old. That is a story I would proudly shake your hand for. And I am not just saying that to be polite." He looked down at his own resting hands for a brief moment, then looked back up at her. But being incredibly loud is not the same thing as actually listening, and shouting passionately for people is not the same thing as providing answers for them. "Where I come from, Congresswoman, when you say something, you truly mean it. When you tell somebody you are going to do something, you actually execute it, not just because there's a television camera running, not just because it trends on social media, but because you gave your word. And your personal word is the only thing you have got that nobody can forcibly take from you. That is exactly how I was raised. That is exactly how most of the people watching us tonight were raised. Tonight, I ask you 4 direct questions. How much does your climate plan cost? Who financed your luxury dress? Where exactly did your chief of staff's money go? Why did you actively vote no on the bill you claimed would stop a concentration camp? 4 questions. 4 beautiful speeches. The specific kind of speeches that make a person incredibly famous. But the people sitting at home, Congresswoman, the exact ones you passionately say you came here to fight for, the ones who aren't famous, who aren't following you online, and who aren't clapping in a studio, they are still desperately waiting for the answer." He looked at her with an expression that carried no anger and no triumph. It was something incredibly close to gentleness. The specific way you look at someone when you desperately wish the truth were entirely different, but you must accept that it is not. "You have an incredibly brilliant answer for absolutely everything, Congresswoman, except the actual question. 10 words. And they landed in the studio the exact way a heavy stone lands at the dark bottom of a well, not with a deafening crash, but with a sound so minuscule and so definitively final that it simply confirmed exactly how terrifyingly deep the silence had been all along. AOC sat completely frozen in her chair. And the thing that happened immediately next was the singular thing that no camera missed, no editor could cut, and no headline could adequately paraphrase. Because it was not a spoken word, it was the absolute absence of one. Her hands, the exact hands that had violently cut the air for 40 straight minutes, the hands that had aggressively pointed at Kennedy, swept dramatically toward the camera, and conducted every single syllable of every speech with a gesture so heavily practiced it looked identical to instinct. The hands that 13 million followers had watched 1,000 times before. Hands that had literally become synonymous with the word fight. Hands that never stopped moving simply because the woman they belonged to refused to ever stop fighting. Those exact hands dropped limply to her lap. They rested palms down on the fabric of her pants. Still, not clenched into fists, not aggressively gesturing, not reaching to punctuate the next talking point, just completely still. The exact way hands go completely still when the physical body knows a devastating truth that the mouth has not yet admitted. The way a powerful machine goes completely quiet when someone finally pulls the electrical plug, not with violence, but with the slow, gentle recognition that the power had been running on absolutely nothing for a very long time. The host waited. The cameras waited. 13 million followers waited. She did not speak. The woman who had literally never once in her entire public life been caught without a response sat completely immobilized in a chair on live television and had absolutely nothing to say. Not because she had been viciously insulted, not because she had been shouted down, not because anyone had raised their volume, called her a name, or done any of the toxic things she was expertly built to fight against, but simply because someone had asked a question, and waited, and asked again, and waited. And the waiting was still sitting there in the room, patient as arithmetic, incredibly quiet, like a bill resting on a table, and it was absolutely not going away. The host cleared her throat very softly. "Senator, any final thoughts?" Kennedy straightened his posture in his chair. "No, Mom. I firmly think the math speaks for itself. The resulting clip was a mere 10 seconds long, and it was absolutely everywhere before the studio lights even had a chance to cool down. 10 seconds that inflicted vastly more political damage than 30 years of funded opposition research." Kennedy saying his final 10 words, followed by AOC's hands dropping in absolute silence. Senator Ted Cruz posted exactly 4 words within the hour. Somebody checked the math. Elon Musk reposted the viral clip without a single caption. None was needed. The math had already been independently checked by everyone watching. A conservative commentator who had spent years aggressively attacking AOC posted something incredibly different that night. Not a vicious attack, not a joke, just a single, profound sentence. "I have never seen someone win a fight simply by asking questions and doing long division." It was shared 400,000 times by morning. In a hallway just outside the studio, a Democratic congressman who had served 3 terms alongside AOC stood with his back pressed against the wall and spoke to a reporter without making eye contact. "The problem with her is the exact same problem with all of us," he admitted. "We learned how to expertly perform, we never learned how to actually answer. And the thing about performing is that it works flawlessly right up until somebody in the room decides to just sit there and do the math. Then you're completely done," he noted, looking directly at the floor, before adding significantly quieter, "and she's not the root of the problem. She's merely the first one to succeed using this formula. There will be hundreds of imitators after her, younger, louder, and significantly better at it. And unless somebody starts demanding answers to the math questions, they'll win every single time." He walked away before the audio recorder even came up. That evening on a news panel, a commentator attempted a weak defense. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez possesses an incredibly powerful platform that. The co-anchor interrupted instantly, without even looking up. "A platform is not a plan." The commentator opened her mouth, closed it, and the panel quickly moved on. Nobody circled back. There was simply nothing to circle back to. The math had been definitively done. The question had been asked. The answer had never arrived. Kennedy calmly unclipped his microphone, handing it back to the sound technician, using both hands the exact way a man returns, a borrowed tool he was glad to have used and equally glad to put down. He spoke to the host in a thick Louisiana drawl that sounded like it had been marinating in something slow and warm since long before the invention of television. "I explicitly told my wife this would take exactly 15 minutes. She is going to have thoughts about that." He walked out of the studio without making a statement, taking a victory lap, or making a post. He did not look back at the set, at the 2 empty chairs, or at the broadcast cameras with their red lights now dark. He flew directly back to Louisiana that night. He went home to his wife, his dog, and the kitchen table where a standard calculator sat securely next to the Daily Mail. The exact same calculator he had used since his days as the state treasurer. The calculator that absolutely did not know how to gesture, make passionate speeches, or trend on any social platform. The device that knew only one unshakable thing, which is that 93 trillion divided by 330 million is undeniably still a number that somebody has to pay, absolutely no matter how loud the room gets. If you nodded even once reading this, hit that like button. If you are completely tired of speeches when you explicitly asked for a number, subscribe right now. Leave one word in the comments question. And share this immediately with one person who sits at a kitchen table every single month, doing the actual math, making it work. No camera, no followers, no headlines, just a calculator, a bill, and the quiet, heavy knowledge that the loudest voice in the room was never the actual answer. Somebody finally said it out loud. 10 words, and they were meant entirely for you. They were always for you.